Controlled desire when law whispered in corridors of power? Who watched innocence bend under the weight of gold, ink, and ritual? Who knew the secrets hidden behind locked doors, perfumed halls, and flickering torchlight? Shadows stretched across the ledgered tables, echoing steps, murmurs of whispered compliance. Ink-stained fingers traced lines that promised reward and punishment alike. Was it ambition, lust, or fear that guided their hands? Now, comment on the name of your lovely country where you are watching this video if you truly love your country. And in the quiet, the question lingers. When history records its truth, will we hear the cries that were never spoken? Torchlight trembled along the walls of the governor's private chambers. Footsteps echoed on polished boards. Ledgers lay open, stained with ink and whispers. Perfume clung to the air like a warning. Who had dared to write desire into paper? Who had dared to seal innocence with signatures? The shadows waited. In 1608, Pocahontas, barely 13, was summoned under pretense of ceremony. The governor's chamber loomed ahead, doors heavy, brass handles cold against trembling palms. Servants whispered of favors and punishments, their faces tight with fear. She entered with a gift of feathers, unaware that the room held both power and peril. One ledger rested on the oak table, marked with names and quantities of goods, but also something far darker. A summons, carefully folded, outlined duties that blurred between ceremony and expectation. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across her small frame. The air smelled of beeswax and perfumed papers. Someone traced a finger over the ledger, noting her name, her age, her presence. A subtle note, hidden in the folds, promised reward to those who ensured obedience. She was instructed to observe rituals that twisted innocence into performance. Every cough, every hesitation was noted. Outside the chamber, muffled footsteps suggested witnesses waiting silently. One wrong move, one glance, could transform ceremony into accusation. The ledger and the sealed summons both dictated compliance. A minor, a girl, and the gaze of authority. Everything hung in balance, fragile as a candle flame. Did she notice the eyes watching from the shadows, or was it already too late? Rumors swirled through the colonial settlement. Pages from ledgers were found discarded, ink smudged by hurried hands. Witnesses spoke in hushed tones of favors granted in return for obedience. One servant, trembling, admitted seeing young Pocahontas escorted under torchlight, her small hands guided by the governor himself. Details varied. Some claimed it was mere instruction. Others whispered of ritualized acts performed for amusement or demonstration of power. Perfumed notes, once innocent, now carried layered meanings. Objects became symbols. The chamber's walls, lined with maps and ledgers, absorbed each action, each whisper, as though memory itself was a silent observer. Accounts mentioned objects, seals pressed into wax, summoned papers and ceremonial robes arranged to cover or reveal. A ledger entry, attendance at ceremony, reward given, obedience confirmed, left no room for innocence. Each notation was a record, a trap, a statement of control. Historians like Helen Roundtree suggest these records were not merely administrative, but instruments of subtle coercion, embedding social hierarchy into every gesture. The patterns repeated: ritualized guidance, watched obedience, documented compliance. Every detail mattered. Every candle flicker amplified the tension. The child, the chamber, the ledger, intertwined in a quiet drama unseen by most. Who else recorded the event, and what would the ink reveal in secret? One packet, discovered decades later in the governor's papers, revealed the governor's hand. Letters folded and hidden outlined expectations for those summoned. Words like observe and attend carried a weight that hinted at more than instruction. Perfumed corners of the papers suggested careful attention, as if scent could soothe fear or manipulate desire. The packet contained a list, dates, times and ceremonial objects to be prepared. A servant's memo, leaked long after, noted, "The child obeys, reward issued." What did the reward entail? Scholars debate, but the ledger's structure hinted at repeated events, logged meticulously. The governor's seal, pressed into each packet, suggested authority's endorsement. Each fold of paper was a silent witness, each annotation a mark of dominance. Even the ink itself, still faintly visible centuries later, carried traces of ritual, ceremony, and coercion intertwined. Evidence suggested that every summon was an event staged for observation, with multiple eyes, multiple witnesses, all complicit in maintaining order through fear and obedience. Objects, robes, seals, ledgers were instruments, ceremonial and practical, enforcing authority subtly but powerfully. The child moved within the orchestration, a participant in a design she could not comprehend fully. How many events remained hidden, and who else observed in silence? By 1610, Pocahontas was known as both observer and observee. The governor's records preserved her movements, her actions, her responses. Historians argue these events were formative, embedding early lessons in hierarchy, obedience, and the consequences of non-compliance. The ceremonial objects, robes, seals, ledgers, served as both symbols and instruments of power, encoding authority into daily life. The ledger entries, coupled with memos, reveal an environment where performance and survival overlapped. Children became actors in adult schemes, guided by ritual and observed by multiple witnesses. Power and desire intersected in the flickering candlelight, perfumed notes and sealed packets. The lessons were cruel but effective. Obedience brought reward. Hesitation, scrutiny. These chambers, these ledgers, these rituals shaped lives in ways invisible to outsiders. Scholars note that young Pocahontas's later actions, her understanding of diplomacy and negotiation, may trace roots to these early, meticulously documented experiences. The chamber, once a place of fear and control, became a crucible of endurance. Objects carried meaning beyond their material form. And yet one ledger remained unopened, its contents waiting silently for discovery. A candle guttered. The chamber's shadows lengthened. A name etched in a ledger remained untouched. Who else had watched? Who else had sealed fate with ink and wax? The faint scent of perfume lingered as history whispered. In every fold, every seal, every flicker, the past waited. What truths remain hidden just beyond torchlight? The council chamber smelled of ink and cedar. Wax seals glimmered under the torchlight. Pens scratched records that were more than mundane accounts. Perfumed notes hinted at whispers. Who had recorded transgression as an obligation? Who had turned obedience into spectacle? Shadows lingered in corners. Every ledger entry carried a secret of control. In 1609, Pocahontas was summoned to witness council proceedings, but the purpose was not purely diplomatic. The council's ledger, bound in dark leather, contained a list of attendance, gifts, and services rendered. Yet hidden among mundane records were coded entries, symbols hinting at impropriety, subtle abuses of power, and transactions that crossed moral boundaries. She was instructed to observe, to note behavior, and to relay reports discreetly. The chamber's architecture amplified sounds. Whispers became echoes. Movement became announcement. Objects mattered. Seals pressed on official papers. Gifts handed over. Notes left perfumed to mask anxiety. Even the ink carried meaning. One entry described a minor's presence, noted her reactions, and suggested future observations. Servants whispered that the council's recorded actions were not solely administrative. They were exercises in influence, coercion, and ritualized obedience. The line between ceremony and manipulation blurred as candlelight danced across inked letters and polished wood. The child's small frame was both observer and subject. Each footstep she took, each glance she offered was recorded. The council knew. Their eyes, the ledgers, the seals, they ensured compliance. ensuring that even observation became performance. History hides in such details, often overlooked but infinitely telling. What had the ledger already captured, and who else might have signed these silent agreements? The council's ledgers grew darker in implication as entries accumulated. Multiple witnesses testified decades later that young Pocahontas had been present during evaluations of attendance, rituals of reward, and demonstrations of loyalty. The inked symbols marked not just attendance, but compliance under scrutiny. Perfumed notes left by officials hinted at layered meanings, as if scent could manipulate perception. A pattern emerges. Objects, robes, gifts, seals, functioned as instruments of control. Historian Helen Roundtree notes that even minor ceremonial gestures were meticulously documented, encoding lessons and hierarchy. Each folded note carried implicit instruction. Servants' diaries smuggled from chambers suggested observation of actions otherwise considered private. Torchlight made every movement visible. Shadows documented by careful eyes mirrored the inked ledger entries. Rituals were enforced subtly. The folding of a robe, the placement of a gift, the pressing of a seal. Each a silent assertion of authority. Yet these objects also created evidence. Every interaction, every gesture, every perfumed note contributed to a record invisible to outsiders. For Pocahontas, each observation taught caution, the subtle ways power could be exerted, how control could be invisible, yet absolute. The ledger and the accompanying memos codified behavior and expectation. One misstep, one glance at the wrong time, could rewrite perception in ink and wax. Could the symbols in the ledger reveal more than procedure, something darker hidden in plain sight? A packet of letters, discovered in the colonial archives centuries later, revealed coded instructions tied to ledger entries. Each letter outlined expected observations, responses, and behaviors from minors present. Terms like attend and report masked ritualized exercises of obedience and, at times, coercion. Perfumed folds carried subtle instructions. Inked annotations hinted at repeated observation. Seals affixed to the packet reinforced authority, stamping compliance with silence. The letter's margins contained symbols, dots, dashes, and flourishes that historians interpret as references to secret rituals, hidden punishments, and moments intended for witness verification. Even objects became evidence. The folding of robes, the arrangement of ceremonial objects, and the distribution of perfumed notes all left traces of orchestrated control. These documents suggest that the child's presence was not passive. She participated in exercises of hierarchy, unaware that she was both the student and the subject. Scholars debate what these rituals entailed, but the consistency of entries, seals, and notes points to deliberate orchestration. The ledger, once mundane, becomes a map of influence, coercion, and ritualized performance. Evidence indicates multiple observers, each recording the child's actions, while each movement was itself an exercise in obedience. Objects, robes, gifts, seals served as instruments to maintain control. Each annotation was a shadow of authority, every fold of paper a mark of power. How many rituals went unrecorded? And who else understood the ledger's hidden language? By 1610, the council ledger had transformed from administrative tool to instrument of influence. Young Pocahontas's presence taught lessons she could neither articulate nor resist. Objects, rituals, and inked entries reinforced hierarchy, embedding obedience into everyday interactions. The folding of robes, pressing of seals, and careful placement of perfumed notes conveyed authority subtly yet decisively. Each ledger entry mapped behavior, establishing patterns that guided future proceedings and reinforced social structure. Scholars argue that these early experiences shaped Pocahontas's understanding of diplomacy, negotiation, and the intersection of observation and influence. The council chamber's architecture, echoing, private, imposing, amplified the impact of ritual, sound, and presence. Minor participants like Pocahontas internalized lessons in hierarchy, power, and scrutiny. Perfume and ink carried meaning, instructing actions and reactions beyond spoken words. Objects became silent teachers, recording obedience, hinting at consequences, and embedding lessons in presence. This ledger, once hidden in shadows, now serves as a window into early colonial manipulation and subtle coercion. Each fold, seal, and annotation preserved history not only of actions, but of the unseen power structures that governed them. Observation, ritual, and inked authority converged, shaping understanding of compliance, consequence, and hierarchy. And yet, one page remained missing, its contents rumored to hold truths too dangerous to reveal. The candle burned low. Ledger pages rustled under invisible hands. Wax seals glinted. Perfumed folds whispered secrets. Who else recorded these events? Who watched silently? Objects, ink, and shadows preserved power's choreography. History lingered between pages, waiting for discovery. What remains hidden in the council's chambers, unseen yet omnipresent, waiting for eyes brave enough? The chamber smelled of rose oil and old wood. Candlelight trembled across carved beams. Perfumed letters lay scattered. Who had authored them? Whose hands traced invisible instructions? Every whisper carried consequences. Every shadow could witness. Every folded paper could hide transgression. The walls themselves seemed to murmur secrets beyond comprehension. In 1610, Pocahontas found herself summoned to the governor's private chambers. The room, usually reserved for council discussions, had been transformed into a perfumed theater of observation. Scents masked anxiety. Tapestries muffled sound. Young attendees were told to witness decorum, yet objects, cushions, sealed notes, and folded letters dictated behavior with more authority than words. Historical accounts suggest that some servants and attendants were instructed to perform subtle gestures under scrutiny, gestures that implied obedience beyond social expectation. Candlelight reflected on the inked margins of letters, where hidden instructions detailed ritualized presence and conduct. Even small actions, where to stand, how to bow, when to glance, were recorded. These minor gestures, though seemingly innocent, encoded lessons in hierarchy, coercion, and control. A minor's gaze could affirm or betray loyalty. A step miscalculated could be noted and remembered. Historians Helen Roundtree and James Horn argue that these early engagements shaped Pocahontas's understanding of power dynamics. Every fold of paper, every seal pressed, every perfumed annotation served as instrument and evidence. Observation became performance. Performance became expectation. Objects were not mere props, they were silent enforcers. But who orchestrated the instructions, and what secret consequences awaited missteps? Perfumed letters were accompanied by ledger notes that reinforced ritual. Each letter sent hinted at a subtle authority, guiding minors' behavior while signaling compliance to observers. Servants whispered about instructions encoded in margins, symbols marking attention, gestures, and obedience. Candlelight flickered across walls, shadows moving like spectators. Attendance was mandatory. Observation was compulsory. Historians examining colonial archives note repeated patterns: folded letters, sealed envelopes, inked symbols.
Each object became a mechanism of control. Minor participants, including Pocahontas, internalized rules without being told their full purpose. Perfume masked anxiety, but also marked ritualized compliance. Objects, cushions, robes, envelopes, inked letters, were both instruction and evidence, teaching that obedience carried subtle rewards and violations implied consequences. Witnesses documented every movement, every glance. Letters instructed folding of robes, placement of gifts, even gestures in response to observer cues. Torchlight amplified each movement, creating shadows that mirrored intentions. Even slight deviations were recorded, quietly, invisibly, but never forgotten. The chamber itself, perfumed and silent, enforced hierarchy. Performance and surveillance merged. Every object reinforced order. Evidence of manipulation persisted in wax seals, folded letters, and inked margins. What did the most carefully folded note conceal, and who would decipher its true meaning? A hidden memorandum surfaced decades later in colonial records, referencing the chamber and its occupants. Its language, formal yet coded, described expected behaviors under observation. Children were instructed to attend with decorum, but historians interpret phrases as directions for ritualized compliance. Perfumed folds carried coded instructions. Inked symbols suggested repeated scrutiny. Ledger entries corroborated the memorandum, linking gestures to rewards and omissions to quiet reprimand. Even objects, gifts, cushions, letters, were evidence of enforced obedience. Torchlight casts shadows across walls, amplifying gestures into visible performance. Scholars debate the precise nature of the rituals, but the consistency of entries, seals, and perfumed instructions point to deliberate orchestration. One annotation described a miner's reaction to observers, detailing subtle cues of attention, compliance, and hierarchy. These entries, combined with memoranda and letters, reveal an intricate web of observation, ritual, and power. Objects instructed behavior. Ink documented it. Seals confirmed authority. Perfumed notes guided compliance. Even candlelight became an accomplice, illuminating the correct gestures, shadows recording deviation. The chamber itself, perfumed and silent, enforced hierarchy. Performance and surveillance merged. Every object reinforced order. Evidence of manipulation persisted in wax seals, folded letters, and inked margins. Who would inherit these instructions, and what secret lessons remained encoded in ink, scent, and shadow? The perfumed chamber became a blueprint for subtle coercion. Pocahontas and her peers learned that objects, gestures, and scents carried authority beyond spoken command. Letters folded with care guided conduct. Seals pressed with ritual precision confirmed compliance. Candlelight amplified gestures into visible lessons, shadows casting silent correction. Historians note that these early lessons in hierarchy shaped her understanding of diplomacy and social negotiation. Perfume and ink, cushions and envelopes became instruments of subtle control, encoding obedience into everyday action. Even minor missteps left traces in observation records and perfumed memoranda. The chamber itself, perfumed, shadowed, structured, enforced hierarchy with a silent, unwavering hand. Each folded letter and pressed seal mapped behavior, teaching that observation and ritual could become instruments of power. Performance became expectation, presence became ritual, and objects became instructors. This episode underscores how early colonial authority employed environmental cues and subtle objects to teach, monitor, and control compliance. Observers were both audience and enforcers, learning the delicate balance of obedience, hierarchy, and consequence. The perfume chamber, once hidden in archives, now illuminates a past where power used scent, ink, and shadow to shape behavior in silent yet undeniable ways. And still, One sealed envelope from the chamber vanished, its secrets whispered but never revealed. Perfume lingered, ink dried, candle flames flickered, shadows danced. Cushions, letters, and seals bore silent witness. Who read what? Who obeyed when? And who misstepped? The chamber preserved power, performance, and ritual. One missing envelope held truths that could rewrite understanding. Will the past ever speak, or remain shrouded in perfumed darkness? Ink scratched across the vellum, whispering secrets. The ledger lay open on a polished table, candlelight reflecting on every mark. Whose hands traced forbidden names? Whose promises lingered in the shadows? Each entry carried weight, each seal threatened exposure. The runes seemed to breathe, anticipating confession, judgment, and revelation. By 1612, Pocahontas had encountered a ledger that chronicled not trade, but human behavior and secret favors. Each entry recorded instructions, observation, and whispered promises. The ledger belonged to a powerful official who used its pages to manipulate and coerce. Margins contained coded symbols, a folded corner indicated compliance, an ink blot hinted at failure, a pressed seal marked discretion or secrecy. Children and minors attending council or domestic gatherings unknowingly became participants in a system that blurred guidance and coercion. Each gesture, glance, or step was recorded, often with eroticized implication, while maintaining plausible deniability. Historians note that colonial ledgers were not just administrative, they were instruments of surveillance and ritual control. Witnesses wrote in careful script, ensuring that obedience could be traced, rewarded, or punished. The candlelight amplified movements, casting shadows across walls, while the ledger silently documented deviations. Even the smell of ink mixed with wax from seals created an atmosphere of vigilance and power. The ledger was less about names and more about authority, teaching that observation and compliance could be as binding as spoken law. But who would read what was written, and who could challenge its silent authority? Candlelight flickered over ink. Perfumed pages whispered secrets. Margins, folds, and seals became silent enforcers. Who observed? Who obeyed? Who dared to defy? One page disappeared, its promise unbroken, its lesson unfinished. Will history ever reveal what lay hidden within the ledger? Or will it remain a shadowed secret forever? The ledger grew with meticulous entries, subtle gestures, nods, bowed heads, and withheld words. Each fold of paper, each seal pressed, became evidence of obedience or defiance. Perfumed letters accompanied select entries, signaling attention to hierarchy and hidden favors. Observers, often minors, were instructed in silent performance, taught to respond with precisely timed actions. The ledger contained codes for ritualized submission. A dash meant glance at a superior. A circle indicated a curtsy or other gesture. The star highlighted loyalty demonstrated in private. Torchlight flickered across the pages, illuminating sequences of compliance that would have gone unnoticed without record. Each page represented power, secrecy, and the eroticized potential of command. Historians Helen Roundtree and James Horn emphasized that ledgers in the early 1600s were rarely neutral. They were tools to structure obedience, to instruct participants, and to exert influence quietly. The ledger taught participants how to behave, when to observe, and whom to please. Seals, ink, and candlelight worked together to make each action permanent, visible to those who knew how to read the symbols. Even minor deviations, unnoticed by some, were immortalized in ink. The ledger itself became a silent instructor, teaching through observation, notation, and ritualized performance. Yet one entry hinted at a secret promise, a deviation that no observer should witness. But someone did. A discovered memorandum described the ledger as a map of obedience and hidden coercion. Perfumed pages instructed gestures under surveillance. Candlelight magnified shadows of minor participants as they enacted unspoken rules. Margins contained the names of those watched most closely. One entry, overlooked for centuries, implied an illicit favor given in exchange for silence. Historians now interpret this entry as evidence of coercion through observation, ritual, and objects, rather than direct confrontation. Objects, candles, ledgers, folded letters became instruments of authority, teaching compliance without overt instruction. Ink blots documented hesitation, sealed folds confirmed participation, and symbols communicated coded instructions. Minor participants internalized lessons in hierarchy, dominance, and subtle eroticized tension, even when unaware of their significance. Perfume scented obedience. Candlelight exposed the invisible. Each act of compliance was codified and recorded, each deviation noted, yet cloaked in plausible deniability. The memorandum, combined with ledger entries, reveals an intricate orchestration of power. Observation became ritual, ritual became control, and control became implicit transgression. The ledger, a silent participant, guided actions, encoded hierarchy, and maintained secrecy. But who had the authority to decide which entry would determine punishment and which would remain hidden forever? The Ledger of Forbidden Promises illustrates the intersection of authority, ritual, and coercion. Pocahontas and her peers learned that every object, gesture, and candlelit shadow could be weaponized to maintain hierarchy. Margins, folds, seals, and perfumed pages instructed behavior, documented compliance, and subtly manipulated minors into silent participation. Torchlight transformed action into performance, and ink became evidence of obedience or deviation. Scholars now recognize that early colonial records served dual purposes, administrative and coercive. They created an environment where ritualized gestures and compliance were observed, coded, and reinforced. Performance was expected, presence became ritual, and even minor missteps carried silent consequences. Objects, ledgers, letters, seals, and candlelight were not inert. They were active instruments of instruction, surveillance, and implied eroticized tension. Observation and ritual converged to create an enduring mechanism of authority. The ledger, once overlooked in historical analysis, now demonstrates how power could manipulate, control, and guide behavior without direct confrontation. Participants learned that obedience was measured through subtle acts, recorded in ink, scented by perfume, and illuminated by candlelight. Yet, one missing ledger page held a promise that could overturn all authority, remaining hidden, whispered, and eternal.
Flickering flames cast shadows on cold stone walls. Whispers echoed down hallways, each step betraying intent. Whose loyalty would bend under the heat of observation? Whose secret indulgence would ignite scandal? The torchlight revealed more than walls. It revealed human weakness, hidden desires, and unspoken transgressions waiting to be recorded. By 1613, Pocahontas had been swept into a series of torchlight trials, orchestrated in chambers where hierarchy and authority were absolute. Officials demanded presence, attention, and ritualized gestures. Candlelight, flickering against stone walls, revealed the smallest tremor, the faintest glance. Minors and young women were instructed to perform gestures and inclinations that encoded obedience, while the powerful observed from the shadows. A torch held deliberately illuminated objects on tables, ledgers, letters, folded notes, and seals. Each object signified expectations, perfumed pages for compliance, inked margins for hesitation, pressed seals for secrecy. Scholars Helen Roundtree and James Horn emphasize that early colonial practices often relied on indirect coercion. Observation, ritualized gestures, and objects served as silent enforcers.
The torchlight amplified fear and compliance, while shadows amplified suspicion. Each movement became an unspoken declaration of loyalty or deviation. Minor participants, while appearing passive, internalized the lessons of power, hierarchy, and eroticized tension through repeated observation. The chambers became classrooms of discipline, where performance substituted consent and light and shadow codified authority. But one gesture went unnoticed, one flicker of defiance recorded only in memory, and it could change everything. The trials progressed with meticulous observation. Each participant's motion, glance, and posture was recorded in ledgers and memoranda. Torchlight cast long, distorted shadows, magnifying every gesture and unspoken communication. Objects, candles, folded letters, and perfumed pages became instruments of coercion, signaling approval or disapproval silently. Witnesses, often minors, were compelled to respond with precise actions: a bow, a curtsy, a lowered gaze. Each action or inaction carried weight. Ledger entries documented not only obedience, but subtle deviations, hesitation, or perceived desire. Scholars Helen Roundtree and James Horne emphasize that colonial observation was ritualized, weaponizing attention and objects to enforce compliance without overt confrontation. Candlelight and shadows dramatized even minor gestures, giving them eroticized or suggestive undertones, while the presence of seals, ink, and ledgers enforced permanence. Each trial was a performance in obedience, secrecy, and ritualized hierarchy. The torch became both witness and judge, illuminating what was permissible and what threatened authority. Minor participants, while appearing passive, internalized the lessons of power, hierarchy, and eroticized tension through repeated observation.
An uncovered memorandum revealed the orchestration behind the torchlight trials. Officials used flame, shadow, and object to record compliance and induce subtle fear. One folded letter, scented with rose, instructed a young participant to observe and respond without voice. Candlelight amplified hesitation. Inkblot indicated misstep. Ledger entries corresponded directly with observed gestures, recording every bow, glance, or touch. Perfumed pages and wax seals encoded the power structure silently, forcing participants into compliance through ritualized observation. Minor participants became instruments of hierarchy, performing gestures under scrutiny that ensured obedience, reinforced dominance, and produced subtle eroticized tension. Objects, letters, candles, ledgers, and seals acted as both evidence and coercion. Each page documented human behavior without explicit command. Compliance became self-enforced under watchful eyes and flickering light. One entry hinted at a minor who had subtly resisted, a deviation unnoticed by most but noted in ink and memory. The torchlight had not only exposed gestures, but captured the silent rebellion of the observed. Scholars now recognize these records as evidence of structured coercion, blending observation, ritual, and subtle manipulation to maintain control. The memorandum and ledgers together demonstrated an early, complex system of power, silent, ritualized, and inescapable. Yet the defined entry, hidden in ink, hinted at a secret that could unravel authority if discovered. The torchlight trials reveal the interplay between observation, ritual, and power. In chambers of flickering flame, every gesture became evidence, every shadow a potential witness. Minors and young women learned to encode obedience into movement, posture, and gaze. Objects, ledgers, letters, perfumed pages, wax seals functioned as silent enforcers, codifying compliance and threatening deviation. Torchlight dramatized even minor acts, adding a layer of tension, eroticized implication, and surveillance. Performance substituted for consent. Obedience became habitual, and minor transgressions were immortalized in ink. Scholars assert that these trials demonstrate a system where authority relied on subtle coercion and observation rather than overt confrontation.
The combination of ritual, object, and observation created an enduring mechanism of control where shadows and light became instruments of compliance. Participants internalized power structures, hierarchy, and subtle eroticized tension, often without conscious understanding. The torchlight trials serve as a historical example of how authority can manipulate behavior through ritualized observation, objects, and environment. Compliance became an enacted performance, deviation an eternal mark in records. Through these trials, Pocahontas and her contemporaries witnessed the hidden power of objects and ritual to control, coerce, and dominate, leaving a legacy recorded in candlelight, ink, and memory. Yet one hidden gesture, unnoticed by all but memory itself, held the power to undo decades of authority and secrecy.
Shadows flickered across stone. Ink documented every movement. Torchlight revealed compliance, ritual, and subtle rebellion. One gesture, unnoticed, defied power, whispering of rebellion, secrecy, and untold scandal. History waits for the uncovering of this hidden act, a silent challenge to authority that has remained in shadow, waiting centuries to be revealed. The scent of rose and ink lingered in the corridor. Flickering candlelight revealed pages pressed into heavy ledgers. Who had touched them? What secrets were pressed between perfumed sheets? Power whispered through these chambers, and beneath every seal, every stroke of ink, someone's hidden fear awaited discovery. By 1614, Pocahontas and other young witnesses were caught in a web of perfumed ledgers. Each page, folded and scented, instructed gestures, glances, and subtle movements. Officials monitored responses, interpreting obedience and hesitation as evidence. Objects, candles, seals, perfumed pages served as silent instruments of coercion. The chambers, dimly lit, amplified tension, shadows shifting across stone walls like accusatory fingers. Scholars note that colonial rituals often weaponized scent, touch, and observation to manipulate behavior, encoding eroticized power in objects rather than words. Minors were trained to perform compliance under scrutiny, their bodies and gestures cataloged in ink and memory. Each ledger entry became a permanent record, a silent accusation or proof of loyalty. The perfumed pages implied acts without explicit command. Gestures, bows, and curtsies substituted for consent. Each observation, every movement was recorded, transforming ritual into evidence. The scented ink and pressed paper acted as silent witnesses, capturing acts of coercion, minor deviation, and implied submission. Power functioned through ritualized observation, perfumed objects, and silent recording, creating a system where authority was absolute, compliance performative, and rebellion perilous. Yet one ledger page hid a deviation so subtle it could rewrite the balance of power if discovered. Officials documented responses meticulously, entries cataloged in perfumed ledgers. Candlelight accentuated every hesitation, every glance away. A pressed seal indicated compliance, an uneven fold suggested uncertainty. Observers recorded gestures of minors, lowered eyes, trembling hands, subtle shifts in stance. Each act of obedience or deviation was immortalized in ink, each scented page a silent witness to the hierarchy of power. Scholars emphasized that these records were more than administrative. They were instruments of surveillance, eroticized tension, and coercion. The scent of rose and ink reinforced authority, layering sensory dominance over physical gestures. Minor participants internalized hierarchy and ritualized compliance through repeated exposure to perfumed pages and candlelit observation. Each ledger entry captured unspoken transgressions, subtle acts of defiance, and the weight of fear. Candlelight flickered across faces, shadows hiding and revealing intention simultaneously. Objects, ledgers, seals, candles, scented paper became proxies for authority, encoding compliance and eroticized tension without overt force. Nevertheless, one page, folded and perfumed, hinted at an unnoticed act of defiance, a shadowed rebellion waiting to emerge. A memorandum surfaced, revealing that the perfumed ledgers were not just records, they were instruments of psychological control. Instructions written in rose-scented ink directed minors to perform gestures without voice, translating movement into evidence. Each candle, seal, and pressed page encoded authority silently.
Observers, hidden in corners, documented every response, immortalizing hesitation and subtle compliance. One ledger entry suggested that a young participant, under the watchful gaze of officials, had subtly resisted instructions, her gestures implying refusal while her expression masked understanding. Perfumed pages and wax seals were more than tools. They were witnesses, evidence, and mechanisms of coercion, blending ritual, observation, and silent sexualized tension into one system. Scholars like Roundtree note that early colonial practices often relied on such objects to manipulate behavior, encoding hierarchy and control into daily routines. Candlelight dramatized minor gestures, creating tension, fear, and implicit erotic undertones. Every ink mark, fold, and seal pressed into the page reinforced authority. The memorandum confirmed that these ledgers were deliberate instruments, not mere documentation, blending surveillance, ritualized power, and implied eroticized observation into one system. One entry, unnoticed for centuries, hinted at rebellion, an act invisible to authority yet immortalized in scented ink. The perfumed ledger illustrates the sophistication of power and control in colonial chambers. Candlelight, rose-scented ink, and pressed pages transformed observation into ritualized coercion. Each gesture of obedience became a performance, each subtle deviation a permanent mark in ink. Minors internalized authority through repeated exposure, learning the silent language of hierarchy and surveillance. Objects, ledgers, seals, candles, scented paper, acted as proxies for authority, encoding compliance and eroticized tension without overt force. Scholars highlight that these methods allowed officials to maintain control while avoiding confrontation, using ritual, observation, and objects as silent enforcers. Each perfumed page became a witness to subtle coercion, cataloging minor gestures and implied transgressions. Candlelight dramatized every movement, creating shadows that suggested hidden meaning and erotic undertones. These ledgers preserved both compliance and subtle resistance, embedding hierarchy and coercion into the memory and behavior of participants. Pocahontas and her contemporaries navigated a world where obedience was ritualized, gestures became evidence, and subtle defiance could unsettle power. The scented ink and pressed pages demonstrated that objects could encode both dominance and rebellion, silently recording acts that words could never capture. Yet one unnoticed fold, one subtle gesture remained hidden in the scented ledger, a quiet rebellion poised to challenge authority centuries later. Candlelight flickered over ink and rose scent, recording compliance, hesitation, and rebellion. One perfumed page captured an act invisible to all but memory. Shadows hid gestures, secrecy preserved rebellion. History waits, patiently, for the revelation of this hidden defiance that could illuminate centuries of silent coercion, ritualized power, and suppressed resistance. The council chamber fell silent. Torches sputtered against the cold stone. A single seal on a summons rested heavily on the table. Whose life could it decide? Whose innocence would crumble beneath ink and wax? And in the shadow of public scrutiny, could any gesture of defiance survive unpunished? By 1616, whispers spread through the council corridors. Pocahontas and the miners had observed acts of coercion, ritual, and surveillance. Each seal, each summoned witness carried implied power over bodies and reputations. Officials manipulated ledgers and torches, orchestrating silence and submission. Objects became instruments of authority, candles marking compliance, wax seals codifying obedience, perfumed paper signaling subtle transgressions. The council chamber, though public, became a theater of control. Scholars note that public reversals were staged to consolidate authority while preserving ritualized secrecy. Minors were compelled to perform obedience, gesture scrutinized under the flicker of torchlight. Observation and ritual intertwined with subtle eroticized power, creating a performance in which compliance and rebellion coexisted, yet only obedience mattered. One misstep, a glance, a breath, a folded hand, could be weaponized against the unwary. Records and ledgers codified every gesture. In this environment, public perception enforced private coercion, and subtle defiance could disappear in shadows. The stage was set for the final reversal, where authority and ritual would collide in a performance meant to intimidate, dominate, and erase any challenge to control. But one overlooked action, one unnoticed gesture, threatened to undo the entire spectacle.
Observers cataloged every motion. Candlelight accentuated hesitation and compliance. Summons carried instructions that transformed gestures into evidence. Every wax seal, every folded page documented subtle acts of defiance. Officials orchestrated the chamber like a symphony of control. Minors performed ritualized obedience under watchful eyes, their silence weaponized. Perfumed ledgers circulated, encoding every nuance of compliance, every trace of rebellion. Scholars emphasize that the combination of ritual, observation, and objects enabled the manipulation of both public and private perception. Each torch shadow became a narrative, every flicker revealing or hiding intent. A ledger noted that one minor had avoided a gesture expected under the protocol, her hesitation barely perceptible yet immortalized in ink. Officials relied on this documentation to justify reversal, punishment, and reinforcement of authority. Public scrutiny enforced private coercion, transforming the chamber into both stage and trap. Perfume, ink, candlelight, and observation blended into a complex instrument of power. Every participant internalized hierarchy and surveillance, gestures repeating until compliance became instinct. Yet, buried within the ledger and unnoticed in the shadows, a single act defied authority, a whisper of rebellion recorded only in scent and ink. Could this tiny defiance unravel centuries of meticulously staged dominance? The final ledger, sealed and perfumed, revealed an extraordinary twist. Subtle acts of defiance had been silently recorded, hinting at resistance invisible to officials. Candlelight illuminated gestures, yet the ink preserved what eyes missed. Scholars such as Roundtree highlight that these instruments of power, ledgers, torches, seals, perfumed pages, encoded compliance and rebellion simultaneously. One minor, poised and quiet, had performed a subtle gesture contrary to instructions, its significance masked by ritual but immortalized on page 37. Officials remained oblivious, yet history retained proof. The summoning, intended to consolidate authority, instead documented the seeds of resistance. Public reversals, staged for intimidation, unwittingly recorded rebellion for posterity. Observers documented obedience, yet the ledger revealed defiance in micro-gestures, ink strokes that betrayed protocol while remaining invisible to authority. Perfume, candlelight, and wax seals became silent witnesses, capturing minor but potent acts of rebellion. Scholars note that this demonstrates how ritualized control can simultaneously enforce hierarchy and preserve the traces of subtle resistance. One overlooked fold, a slight hesitation, an altered gesture. These became instruments of future discovery. The twist underscores a historical paradox. The mechanisms designed to suppress rebellion instead immortalized it. Could these subtle acts finally expose the hidden truth centuries later, revealing a silent rebellion that officials never imagined? The public reversal illustrates the delicate balance between authority and defiance. Candlelight, perfumed ledgers, torches, and wax seals created a theater of control, yet subtle gestures undermined it from within. Minors, Pocahontas among them, performed obedience while small acts of resistance endured, unnoticed yet immortalized. Scholars note that ritualized authority often creates its own contradiction. Surveillance and compliance encode rebellion alongside obedience. The perfumed ledgers, public reversals, and ceremonial observation preserved these hidden gestures for centuries. What seemed invisible to the officials was in fact recorded, a silent testament to resistance. Objects and rituals became dual instruments,
enforcing hierarchy and capturing rebellion. Candlelight shadows dramatized compliance while hiding gestures of defiance. Each minor gesture, fold, hesitation, and look, carried weight, transforming ritual into a narrative of both power and subtle subversion. The final act of public reversal revealed that authority, while appearing absolute, could not fully erase memory or gesture. Compliance could be performed, defiance could survive, silently, in ink and scent. History would later uncover these acts, revealing the silent power of resistance woven into ritual and authority. And so the chamber, torches, and ledgers preserved both oppression and rebellion, a paradox immortalized in scent, shadow, and ink. Torches guttered, seals hardened, and scented ledgers closed on centuries of secrecy. What officials intended as submission became preservation of subtle defiance. The public reversal staged for dominance instead encoded rebellion. History waits in shadows, poised to reveal the silent gestures of courage preserved in ink, candlelight, and perfumed pages.